Okay. I think we are pretty much, we are recording and we are live on YouTube. And a couple other people who are missing, I'm just going to mute you, Bob, for some feedback. Yeah, I'm going to just also ask that you keep muted so we don't get any feedback. And the other people who aren't here can join in, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So it's a couple minutes after 4. I am Sharon Calitro. I'm the planning director here in Danbury, and I just want to thank you all for agreeing to sit on this important committee. As you know, this is our kickoff meeting, and before I turn it over to Francisco Gomes from FHI Studio to introduce himself and Eric Halverson, I thought we could just take a couple minutes to introduce ourselves. You know, you were asked to be on this committee because we feel like you're passionate about the issue of affordable housing in Danbury, and because of your experience and knowledge that you can help us brainstorm strategies that can lead us towards ensuring that we continue to provide affordable housing options in the future in Danbury, and help us to promote the public engagement piece of this process and build support for the plan. Because, you know, housing cuts various departments, Karen and I have kind of partnered this effort together to prepare the affordable housing plan, which is required by state statutes. The affordable housing plan will become part of our plan of conservation and development, which is also underway. Our update has to be done by June of 2023. We are well underway. So we'll end up incorporating the findings of this process into the POCD in the housing section. So it's all really relevant. In terms of managing these meetings, we are, as you know, recording on Zoom, and we are live stream on YouTube, both of which the information was on the agenda that was sent to you. So with that, I'll just call out your name, and if you could just unmute yourself and tell us who you are, and so everybody gets to know each other, that would be really helpful. So again, I'm Sharon Calitro. I'm the planning director in Danbury. Jen?
Jennifer Jennifer Eminger. I'm the deputy planning director.
Great, thanks. Kara?
Hi, everyone. I'm the health director for the city of Danbury, and I'm here with Denise, so I'll just introduce Denise while we're here.
Hey, Denise.
Hello, I'm Denise. I'm with the City of Danbury Health and Human Services. I'm a public health inspector as well as formerly a caseworker for 31 years with the City of Danbury.
Great, thank you. Bobby Botello.
Hello, everyone. Robert Botello from Victorian Associates, local developer, and very proud to be amongst the better people of the area that they're all interested in the same things. So happy to be on board.
Great, thanks. Bob Tabersack. Oh, you have to unmute. Bob Tabersack, you just have to unmute yourself. Yeah, I can't get you. Okay, well, see if we'll come back to you because we didn't hear you. Is Paul Rotello on? I don't think so. Ted Haddad.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ted Haddad, Junior Chairman of the Zoning Commission, and I'm happy to be here as well. Good to see you all.
Thanks. Jen Delaney.
Jennifer Delaney, Danbury Housing Authority, Director of Operations, and thank you for having me.
Thanks, Jen. Perry.
Hi, Perry Salvain, Planning Commission, and thank you for having me as well.
Great, thanks. PJ Prunty.
Good afternoon, everyone. PJ Prunty, I'm President and CEO of the Greater Danbury Chamber of Commerce. Nice to see everyone. Thanks.
Thanks. Christy.
Hi, everybody. I'm Christy Stewart. I'm the director of Fairfield County's Center for Housing Opportunity. Thanks for having me, Sharon.
Thank you. Ari.
Ari Rosenberg. I am the executive director of the Association of Religious Communities.
Great. Thank you all. Let me see if Bob Tabersack, You want to try to unmute yourself, Bob Tabersack? Well, we know Bob is a councilman, very passionate about the issue of housing in our community. So I guess I introduced him for himself. Okay, and missing from this meeting is Paul Rotello, who's a councilman in Danbury. I don't see him on. I'm sure he might be able to chime in later. And with that, I guess I'm going to turn it over to Francisco and let you do your introductions and take it from there. We have a slide presentation and a discussion at the end.
Okay, thanks, Sharon. I'll share my screen now. And just wait for this to go to presentation mode. And can everyone see my screen? Okay, great. So welcome to the first meeting of our affordable housing plan. And thank you for joining us. We have very focused effort this evening to quickly get you up to speed, or this afternoon, I should say, to quickly get you up to speed with what we're working on and the work that's in front of us. Both Eric Halverson, who I'll introduce momentarily, and I have a hard stop at 5:30. We have other meetings we have to jump onto, so we'll try to get through this as quickly as possible and leave enough time for discussion so we can hear some feedback from you. So our agenda this evening, well, we've already gotten started with the introductions. I'll momentarily introduce myself and Eric as well. But we'll briefly review the project scope and schedule. We'll talk about 830G and the affordable housing plan requirement. And then we'll do a brief overview of demographic and socioeconomic trends in Danbury, as well as take a look at your housing stock and issues related to housing cost. Eric will also go into a little bit of detail on the housing affordability analysis that his team conducted for the study, and then we'll open it up to discussion and talk about affordable housing needs in Danbury. So brief introduction. I'm Francisco Gomes. I'm a senior project manager with FHI Studio. We are currently working with the city to develop their plan of conservation and development. So it's very good timing that we can also address the issues related to the affordable housing plan, as the two of them are very closely related. And we are joined by our sub-consultant, RKG. And Eric, can you briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Eric Halverson. I'm a principal with RKG Associates. I manage our Boston, Massachusetts office. And we're happy to be joining Francisco and FHI on the POCD as well as the Affordable Housing Plan.
Thank you, Eric. And a little bit more about FHI. We are a planning firm of about 50 people with office in Hartford and New York City. I work out of our Hartford office, and we do work throughout the Northeast. And I do work with a lot of communities in Connecticut, both small and large. Okay, so our project scope, first of all, guiding this project is our committee. And we plan on meeting with you 5 times over the course of the plan development. And what our team will do, both my team and FHI Studio and Eric and his team, is we're going to collect all the data, present the data, try to find meaning in the numbers and the data, and then come back to you with recommendations, best practices, ideas for how the city can respond to housing need and provide affordable housing. We will do a limited amount of community engagement that's tailored to the affordable housing plan. We're also doing a much broader community engagement effort through the POCD. And our community engagement for this effort will consist of a virtual public meeting and an online survey as well. And then finally, we'll be developing the plan document as required by the state through the course of that. And I'll get into that in a little more detail. So our schedule, there's our meetings. We plan on meeting monthly. It's going into winter. And so that's our collaboration with you occurring throughout the project. We're starting that out with data collection. I'd say we're halfway into this process. And then public engagement. Once we get our feet underneath us here, we'll start to get out and engage the public in a conversation about housing needs. And then finally, the really packaging up the plan to meet the state's mandate will occur in about the second 2/3 of the project. And then we, of course, we need to bring that to public hearing and approve it. So the affordable housing plan really initiates or it has its history in Connecticut Statute 830G. And I don't want to make any assumptions that we all know what this is. So let's go ahead and define it for you right now. 830G is Connecticut statute, and 830G is the number of the statute that basically compels towns and cities across the state to work towards having a 10% affordable housing stock. So of their occupied housing units, 10% need to be affordable through a certain criteria or formula. So this is typically, we often refer to as capital A affordable, in that it's qualified based upon the state's fairly strict definition of affordable housing. That can get lost in the bigger conversation about housing that is affordable for working people and housing that's affordable in Fairfield County. So I want to distinguish between the two. The state's mandate is very strictly defined. So the way the state enforces this mandate is basically, if you do not have 10% affordable housing stock in town, local developers can bypass your planning and your zoning regulations and your zoning commission in affordable housing developments, provided they meet certain requirements. And so the incentive to make sure you have 10% affordable housing is to maintain control over development in your community without local developers bypassing you and seeking an appeal through the state. Danbury is exempt. It has 12% of its occupied housing is affordable housing. So you're not immediately, or you're not vulnerable to development applications that you can't control right now. But that 12% isn't in perpetuity. There are units that number fluctuates from year to year. There are units that basically graduate from affordable housing deed restrictions. So it's important that we are very intentional in these efforts to ensure that you don't slip behind. In addition to the fact, if you have a lot of housing, market rate housing development in the city, your volume of housing is going up, and so your share of affordable housing could be shrinking. So those are all the reasons why it's still very relevant to have an affordable housing plan and to be mindful of how much affordable housing that you do have. So what is affordable housing by the state standards? Well, it's housing that's deed restricted, which basically means that that housing is restricted to certain types of incomes, and there's a formula for that. And it's based upon statewide medians for earnings. And there it is right there. I won't spell it out for you. So there's a deed restricted component. And then there are also qualified units can be units that are government assisted, which would be like a housing authority property, or tenant rental assistance, which I think we all associate with Section 8 housing vouchers. And then also homes that are backed by CHFA or USDA mortgages for affordable housing. So when you compile all those together, you get your totals. And this is a list from the state of all of the communities in Connecticut that have 10% or more of affordable housing. And there's about 30 or so communities, and Danbury's highlighted in yellow on the list. And your affordable housing portfolio is comprised of around 1,600 government assisted units, 1,200 plus tenant rental assistance, 565 federally backed mortgages, and 289 deed restricted units. So that grid on the bottom, all the gray is market rate, and then everything that's color coded in blue is the different types of affordable housing that you do have. So affordable housing need in Danbury. I think we're all probably very aware of the fact that housing affordability is an issue everywhere, particularly in Fairfield County. And while Danbury may be one of the more affordable communities in Fairfield County, it's still very expensive for people to afford housing. And to give you an idea, this is a really nice numbers from Partnership for Strong Communities. So 23% of households spend between 30 and 50% of their income on housing. And this is in Danbury. 18% of households spend more than half of their income on housing. And the hourly wage that's necessarily for a household to afford a 2-bedroom apartment in Danbury is north of $33 an hour, which that is almost 3 times what the minimum wage is. So this is why housing affordability is such an important issue throughout the state, and particularly in Fairfield County. Now, one of the reasons why we're here today is that the state there's instituted a new mandate via Connecticut Statute 830J, which requires towns to put together an affordable housing plan. So that the state is really, upping the ante on communities and really trying to get them to be more proactive in identifying ways to increase their affordable housing stock. And so that basically requires that the city and other municipalities in the state prepare a plan every 5 years, and that you go through a process, as we will be going through, to do outreach in building that plan. And finally, it goes to a public hearing, and then it's regularly reviewed and consulted in making land use decisions and housing decisions. The plan elements, there is some very kind of high level loose guidance. This is a new planning tool in Connecticut, and there are more examples coming from all over the state in different sized communities. The state did, in cooperation with the Regional Plan Association, produce a nice guidance document last year, and that's very loose guidance. So there's some room for interpretation in developing a plan that's really going to best suit your needs. But at the very least, we need to have a vision statement for what it is you're trying to achieve with respect to affordable housing. And take a look at the history in Danbury and provide the basic statistics on demographics and housing supply. Take a look at your zoning and seek opportunities for affordable housing there. Take a look at market conditions, and finally, most importantly, put together an implementation strategy that has goals and actions that will enable you to work towards increasing your affordable housing supply. Okay, so let me pause there, and before I'm going to turn it over to Eric to get into the numbers, but before we do so, does anyone have any questions so far?
Yes, I was just curious, those numbers about Danbury being about 12%, that's from 2020. Do we know how much the pandemic has affected this? Do we think trends and trajectories are going up or down?
Yeah, so
Yeah, go ahead,
you want me to
Sharon.
answer that? Yeah,
Please
so
do, yeah.
yeah, so Ari, every year the state sends around a request to update their list of, and as Francisco said, very defined way that they, their definition of what counts on the affordable housing list. So the 2020 list came out in 2021. The 2021 list will come out next year. We just gave them an update on, again, units. We're working with Jen and the Housing Authority, and whatever deed restricted units came online and were CO'd, we've added them to our list. But it's the same, we go back through basically the same list and update it and/or watch if there are, for instance, deed restricted units that fall off because, they were only deed restricted for 20 years and they've been on the list for, 20 years. So that is what comprises the 12%. And as Francisco said, there's the small a in affordable. And I think that that's, we just have to be mindful of, they're two different definitions.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sharon.
Sharon or Francisco?
Oh, hey, Paul.
Hi,
Hey,
Paul.
Sharon.
Hi.
What would happen if a landlord or even an owner was selling a property for 80%, 20% below market? I mean, if you can, and Francisco, you could go back to that slide that defined actually affordable housing, but there have got to be, a reserve. Okay, so if it turns out in a community, let's say in an urban environment, downtown Danbury, that apartments are rented for, just on the private market, for at or below what the state defines as affordable housing, even though they're not deed restricted, does that make any difference? I mean, that would actually be market rate affordable housing. It makes no difference.
It doesn't count unless there's actual deed restrictions, recorded deed restrictions, and we have to submit them copies of the contracts to, or the recorded restrictions to the Department of Housing, and so they verify that they meet all these requirements. I mean, if somebody wanted to do that voluntarily, okay, but again, they're deed restricting. They only count if they're deed restricted for 40 years with 15%. Less than 15 in.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that somebody out of the goodness of their heart would just be, oh boy, we need more affordable housing. I have a ton of units, so I'll do that. I'm just wondering what would happen if the market itself decided that those properties needed to be rented for that amount so that they could actually be occupied. And would there be any way, does the city have any way to find out what landlords in general are charging? Because it could turn out that we're at 12% officially, but we're 25% unofficially, or we're at 12% with a tremendous amount of pressure to push that down to 10 or 8%, because every landlord is now renting at, say, 50% above or 70% above what the state defines as affordable housing. I think from a public policy point of view, if we're bending over backwards to make these things affordable and we're already over the 10% mark, we ought to look at what the market's actually doing, because that would give us a little bit more play. Once we've hit I don't want to dominate this thing, but I'm just thinking out loud here. I'm spitballing. Once we've hit the state minimum, which we've exceeded that by 20%. Maybe we could look at what the market's actually doing and see, because I have no idea what people are actually renting apartments for.
The market's going up right now, quite a lot actually, I think, as people have moved to the area. It's definitely not going down.
Well, I can tell you, under this definition, I have many apartments. Every one of them is at 80% or less. All my urban apartments are renting for less than what the state is defining as affordable housing. And I don't think that I'm all that unique. I think in the urban environment where I am, that's actually pretty common. But I don't know. So is there a way to find out?
I can offer you one bit of data, Paul, if it's helpful, which is we've been working on a lot of research with the state, and we know that 52% of renters in Danbury, so renters, not household, are housing cost burdened, and we keep track of those numbers pretty carefully.
So what would that?
We're going to get to those numbers too.
Yeah, what would that number be for a one bedroom, just off the top of your head?
I'd have to look it up. I don't know, Sharon, you may know.
Yeah,
sorry,
no.
I work across.
I would say let's get Eric and Francisco and get through this presentation, because you might hear some information that will help answer these questions. But again, these are very, very specific. You have to prove it to the Department of Housing that in terms of the deed restrictions, and we have had units built over the years through our housing incentive program. Well, either through an 830G application a long time ago, or now they take a 2G, which is 80% or less for 40 years, and those get counted in this list as well. So we've been trying to, utilize whatever tools we can to either incentivize or developers to do that, or at least ensure that whatever we have is being counted. Because again, and then I'm gonna be quiet. The denominator in the determination of the 10% is the census. We're going to get results of a new census in the next 4 months. That's going to change the denominator. So unless the numerator changes significantly, and with units dropping off because of the deed restrictions or whatever else may occur, that 12, you're close enough to 10% to be kind of teetering on the edge. We're not at communities.
A number just came up in the chat box of 1451, and I can tell you that I don't have a single apartment that's above that. They're all below that.
Yeah.
So every one of mine, which is not government mandated affordable housing, is in actual fact, according to the formula, affordable housing. And again, I can't think that I'm all that unique, but it's something to think about if what we're really trying to do is make housing affordable, as opposed to simply crossing a T and dotting an I as far as what a government regulation is. That's all. That's all I would. That's the only place.
Can I make one suggestion and one interjection that I've been listening? And one thought that I'd like to make is that you have a primary and secondary market in rentals. So the primary market would be all of your rental complexes, like the Hillcross, which have changed name, and the other places that are in that category. So that you have the primaries, which you can pretty much look online and be able to get what their costs are. Right. And you can also go to MLS to see what's happening there. So, I mean, the exercise to find out what the primary units are doing is pretty accessible. But once again, in the secondary, you don't know if it's going to be hands length, that people are renting to friends or renting to family, whatever. The secondary market is going to be so much different than the primary market, is what I'm trying to say.
And by that, Robert, you mean like the mom and pop market? That
yes,
kind of
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And there's
like,
a lot of them.
People like yourself, which there's a lot, but it's going to be impossible to track that. But you can track what's happening with the Toll Brothers and the other people in the world that have to go through MLS or go through the system, which we can track very easily.
Okay.
So
all right. Thank you.
That you can do.
Thank you,
Okay,
Robert. Sharon,
I'm going to suggest, no problem. Francisco, why don't you continue along, let Eric get into some of the more the nitty gritty of it. And I think you'll see some interesting statistics.
Yeah. All right, Eric, the floor is yours. I'll advance the slides for you, and we'll have to, move through it in a timely manner if we're going to have time for some discussion at the end. So go ahead.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Yeah, hopefully this data presentation, it's a little heavy, but hopefully it will give all of us the kind of baseline information that we need to have the discussion at the end of this presentation also going forward. So just first, we'll start with some really quick demographic context as changes in population, the households in the city, as well as employment. They all impact demand for housing today, as well as housing into the future. According to the CT Data Center's projections, as well as the census, so looking back, Danbury's population grew by about 13% over the last 10 years. But then when we look forward, it's projected to grow by about another 6% or another 5,000 residents through the year 2030. So over the next 10 years, according to the projections from the State Data Center. Next. So with that growth, though, it hasn't really been even when we look across age cohorts. Most of Danbury's recent growth, sort of much like that when we compare it to Fairfield County, has been within the age cohorts of about 18 to 24-year-olds, as well as the older residents over the age of 55. And actually, in fact, Danbury's really outpaced the county in both of those categories over the last 10 years, looking from 2010 to 2019. Next. Danbury is an increasingly diverse community with respect to race and ethnicity, where the percentage of white residents dropped nearly 15% over the last 10 years. And those residents who identify as either Black, Latinx, or some other race all increased pretty sharply. In actual numbers, Danbury's population lost about 7,700 white residents and gained about 12,900 residents who identified as a race or ethnicity other than white. Next. In terms of households, non-family households, which are categorized as either single person households or two or more unrelated individuals living together are growing at a faster rate than family households. So those individuals who are related either by blood or by marriage. Increases were seen amongst those living alone, both younger and older householders that are living alone. And interestingly, Danbury also saw a pretty significant increase in single parent households over the last 10 years, particularly single parent female head of households. Single parent households in Danbury comprise about 18% of all households currently. Next. The growth in households did not occur as rapidly as the growth in total population over the last 10 years, which we think was the result of increasing household sizes, primarily driven by increases in households that have 5 or more people. So the number of households, I'll say that again, did not sort of increase at the same pace as the growth in total population, which is leading to larger household sizes. Those larger household sizes occurred in both renter and owner households. Older householders, particularly those over the age of 65, comprise the largest share of ownership household growth, while those residents or householders ages 35 to 64 were the primary drivers of renter household growth. Next slide. Just shifting gears to education and income, since those two are tied closely together, they also drive what households or individuals can afford from a housing perspective. Danbury residents are becoming more highly educated. Over the last 10 years, residents who earned a bachelor's degree or higher increased by about 11%, or just over 1,800 new residents rather. Although these are large gains when we compare to the county here on the graphic to the right, Danbury does still fall behind the county in terms of the rates of bachelor's degrees or those who are earning over bachelor's degrees. Next. So as I mentioned, education levels and incomes are often tied very closely together. The increase in education for Danbury residents appears to have translated into higher incomes for households over the last 10 years. Danbury saw a pretty sharp increase in household income driven by households earning over $100,000 per year, as you can see in the graphic to the right. This followed a similar pattern to that of Fairfield County as well. And we know that this has direct implications for what those households can actually afford to pay or are willing to pay for housing. Next. While growth in household income was fairly universal across categories of race and ethnicity, it was not necessarily equitable. Latinx households have some of the lowest incomes in the city, somewhere between $15,000 and $20,000 lower than most other households in the city. This too has direct implications on how much a particular household can afford from a housing perspective. Next. In Danbury, people of color, householders of color tend to be concentrated in and around the downtown area, where many overlapping issues related to housing occur. And you'll see this map sort of coming up throughout the presentation. When we look at income by housing tenure, so looking specifically at renter or owner households, we actually see some pretty significant shifts as well. Renters are seeing significant upticks in income, especially households that are earning over $100,000 per year. That specific income cohort grew about 98%, or about 800 households over the last 10 years. And it's worth noting that renter households earning less than $25,000 per year also grew. Very little, but it did grow. Again, when we look at incomes across the city, median incomes tend to be the lowest in that sort of central area, correlating with higher concentrations of householders of color or people of color. So to accommodate the growing number of residents as well as the growing number of households, Danbury actually saw an increase in housing units over the last 10 years, growing by about 3% since 2010. That growth was split primarily between structures of 20 or more units, which accounted for, I think, about 730 units of additional housing units over the last 10 years. In terms of the composition of the city's housing stock itself, single-family homes continue to make up the largest share of Danbury's housing stock at about 54% of all housing units. But the city has seen growth in both duplex units, as well as I mentioned before, buildings and structures with 20 or more units, which accounted for about 2% of growth in each category over the last 10 years. So as we start to think about the condition of those housing units or those structures, we like to look at the year built of units and structures and also map it to try and see where across the city we have older units versus newer housing units and sort of where they exist geographically across the city. So housing units are pretty well dispersed across the different year builds, which you can see in the table sort of on the bottom left of the screen. With about 40% of all units constructed after 1980. And quite frankly, by New England standards, that's pretty good. But again, you'll see the blue coloring on the map, again, mostly concentrated in the central part of the city, where we have the overlap with lower income households, higher concentrations of rental housing, and some of the most intensely developed areas of the city. So now we're going to shift again to look more specifically at owner and renter households and units. So today, about 58% of all occupied units are owner occupied. About 42% of all units are renter occupied. Over the last 10 years, Danbury has seen its renter occupied households grow by about 14%. This is a trend we're seeing in many parts of the country with demographic and income shifts, creating really strong demand for rental housing. As we mentioned earlier, much of the household growth for both renters and owners are in that 5+ person household category. Although for renter households specifically, there has been increases across each of the household size categories, including smaller households of 1 and 2 people. The areas with the higher percentage of renter households, again, as I mentioned before, tend to be located in the central part of the city, again, also overlapping with lower income households and our more diverse resident populations. So in addition to occupied units, so those that actually have people and householders living in them, we also looked at vacant units. So Danbury's percent of vacant units has increased over the last 10 years. But if we look at the category of vacant available, which are the owner and the renter units that are actively available for rent or for sale, it's actually come down. And it's about 2.4% or under, which we typically consider a pretty healthy vacancy rate. Usually a healthy vacancy rate in a community somewhere between 3 and 5%. So Danbury is actually kind of below that right now, which could suggest demand for additional housing over time. Interestingly, the number of vacant other units, which is the 2 bars all the way to the right of the graphic, is up almost double over the last 10 years, which is a little bit of concern to us. Units in this category are often uninhabitable. They might be units that are in title disputes, units in foreclosure, or under major renovation, rendering them currently unlivable. This category is usually a good indicator for portions of the housing stock that might need rehabilitation or just some kind of intervention to get them back into productive use. So we'll spend just a few minutes looking at just specifically the owner-occupied housing stock. So in Danbury, about 68% of the ownership housing stock is less than 60 years old, which, as I mentioned earlier, is actually pretty good by New England community standards, where we tend to have much older housing stock than other parts of the country. But that also means that nearly a third of that housing stock is 60 years or older and may need some rehab assistance. That's something, as we think about the housing vision, housing goals, and housing strategies, we might want to come back to and think a little bit more about. In Danbury, about 81% of the owner housing stock can be found in single-family detached, so your traditional single-family homes, as well as single-family attached, so more like a townhouse style. Very typical for most communities that we work in. The rest of the units are spaced pretty evenly across all the other categories, with about 5% of the units in buildings with 10 or more units. Interestingly, from a value side and a sales side, median home value, as reported by the census, actually declined in Danbury over the last 10 years, actually by about 12%. Most of the city's housing stock is valued at or above $250,000, but homes valued in that range declined by about 19% over the last 10 years. We think this could be a result of valuation adjustments coming out of the Great Recession. Maybe Danbury was a bit slower to recover over that period of time, but it was kind of an interesting finding. Next, median home values, they do take into account every owner-occupied unit in the city to create that median value. So what we also wanted to look at, in addition to the values of all the owner-occupied housing stock in the city, was actual sales. So owner-occupied housing units that sold over the last 5 years. According to sales data from Redfin, the median home sales price actually increased about 11% over the last 5 years, in contrast to the drop that we saw in median home value over that 10-year period. So for those units that are actively on the market and selling, the prices are going up. And here you can see the number of sales by price point. I wanted to draw your attention to the sharp increase in sales for homes that listed at $300,000 or above, particularly over the last 2 to 3 years. That's the orange line on the top that sort of shoots from 10 all the way up to 42. Most of the categories, price categories, remained relatively flat over the last 5 years. Newer homes tend to be sold for around $100,000 more than those built prior to 1960. So the houses that are built after 1960 are tending to sell for quite a bit more than the older housing stock in the city. And the larger homes, those with about 3 or more bedrooms, those comprise about 70% of all sales. So the larger homes and the newer homes tend to move a little bit more quickly than the smaller homes and the homes that are a bit older. Next. So shifting gears and looking at the rental housing stock side, median gross rent in Danbury has increased about 23% over the last 10 years, landing at about $1,466 a month. Sort of further straining the rental households, which are an increasing share of Danbury's overall housing count. So kind of harking back to what we were talking about before. The largest increases were seen in units renting at about $1,500 or more per month. Rents in units priced over $2,000 per month increased about 155%, or an additional 1,160 units over that 10-year period. These increases have direct implications for housing affordability on the renter side, and leading to some pretty severe instances of cost burdening in the city, which I'll share with you in a minute. Within the rental housing stock, about 60% of the units are in structures that were constructed after 1960. But here we see a little bit higher share of units built prior to 1960 compared to what we talked about on the owner-occupied housing stock side. About 40% of rental units are more than 60 years old, compared to about 33% of ownership units. On the building structure side, we also see a much more dispersed housing stock by unit type or building size. Within the rental stock, only about 20% of the units are in single-family structures, compared to 81% for owner-occupied housing. And interestingly, about 60% of all rental housing is in structures with 1 to 4 units, many in duplexes, triple deckers, or fourplexes. In a lot of communities that we work, we tend to see much higher percentages in structures that have 10 or more units. But in Danbury, a lot of the rental housing stock is actually in structures with 4 or fewer units. The graph on the right shows how rents have changed over the last 5 years by unit type. So looking at studios, 1-bed, 2-bed, 3-bed, and 4-bed units, and looking at the prices and how those rents have changed over the last 5 years. You can see how much the 4-bedroom units have increased. They're up about 44%. Probably correlating with the increase in larger renter households I was talking about before. And rents on studios, for example, are also up about 53%. So lastly, we wanted to show you some data on cost burdening. So cost burdening, if you're not familiar, it's a term that's used by HUD to classify households, both renter and owner households, that are spending more than 30% of their household income specifically on housing-related costs. In Danbury, about 55% of all renter households are considered to be cost burden. And on this next slide, we'll look at the differences between owner and renter households, which you can see in the graphic on the right. So in Danbury, as I mentioned, 55% of all renter households are considered cost burden. And 25% of those are considered to be severely cost burdened, which is those households that are spending more than 50% of their income on housing costs. This compares to only 33% of owner households that are cost burdened and 13% of owner households that are severely cost burdened. So when we think about those that are spending more than their sort of fair share on housing costs, our renter households in the city are much more cost burdened than our owner households, which is typical in most markets that we work. But the percentage of renter households here in Danbury that are considered to be cost burdened and those that are severely cost burdened is quite high. So as part of our analysis, we also wanted to try to quantify housing needs today and into the future. So we'll start by quickly looking at housing affordability today in Danbury. So if you can click once, Francisco, about 51% of all renter households, and if you click again, about 25% of all owner households earn less than 50% of the area median income, which is equivalent to about $50,000 or so or less a year. This totals to just over 10,700 households across the city. So it's a pretty significant number. There are about 30% more renter households that are below that 50% of AMI range compared to owners, which is probably attributing to the continued cost burdening and the struggles with affordability for those renter households. We also wanted to look at the number and the location of Danbury's current deed restricted affordable units, or those units which are restricted to households at or below a certain income threshold, which Francisco was sharing at the beginning. As Francisco mentioned, the city currently has about 12% of its year-round housing stock as deed restricted affordable, according to the Connecticut Department of Housing. This does exceed the state's mandated 10% threshold, at least for now, until we get the updated census figures in the next few months. And again, we mapped where these units are located, or these structures are located with the deed restrictions, and we see a sort of similar clustering to what we've seen in the other maps regarding where the renter households are, where our populations of color are located, and our lower income households are located. The next two slides compare owner and renter unit supply and demand gaps by income. So what we try to do is we try to quantify the number of units that are available by price point for both owner and renter households compared to the household incomes of households in the city. And we basically do a math exercise where we subtract the two to see where there might be supply and demand gaps by income threshold. So this first slide shows our gaps and their supply surplus and demand gaps for owner households. And as you can see, there is a deficient number of units affordable to households at or below 30% of AMI, as well as above 100% of AMI. And honestly, this is pretty common in most housing markets that we work, where most of the folks at the extremely low income end, the 30% or below, have a very hard time entering the home ownership market in some cases, or we run into the instance where there really aren't that many units available to those households at those very low price points that they could actually afford. At the upper end, we know incomes in Danbury are increasing, and households at the top of the market could potentially afford to purchase more expensive homes, but don't, either due to the availability of those homes, maybe there just aren't houses available at that price point for them to purchase, or they just desire to pay less than they technically could afford using HUD's sort of 30% of income on housing costs measure. So what ends up happening is this ends up placing pressure on the middle of the market, as you can see by the lighter blue lines that are headed upward on the graphic to the right, ends up placing pressure in the middle of the market where everyone's trying to compete for homes that are priced somewhere between 50% of AMI and that 100% of AMI. Next, on the renter side, we see a very similar issue, but the deficit of units at 30% of AMI and below is substantially higher than that we saw in the previous graphic for owner households. So this means that most extremely low renter households are having to rent units at price points above what they can realistically afford to pay. So this ends up squeezing their monthly budgets and likely cuts into spending on other essential needs like food, childcare, transportation, goods and services, and education. So similar to ownership housing, there's also a deficit at the upper end of the income spectrum with households renting product below what they technically could afford. This again may indicate potential demand for housing priced to households at 100% of AMI or above in this market. So the last section of the presentation deals with population and household projections and trying to translate that into potential future demand for new housing units. As I mentioned earlier, Danbury is projected to add just under 5,000 new residents over the next 10-year period out to the year 2030. So RKG used those projections to run them through our housing demand model, which estimates future demand for both owner and renter housing, as well as demand for new housing stock. We believe there could be demand over the next 10 years for up to about 2,600 additional housing units, sort of above what exists today in the market, which breaks down to about 470 ownership units and 2,150 rental units. This is a 10-year projection, so demand on an annual basis could be as high as 262 units a year. So this next slide just tries to break that down a little bit and illustrate the different components of that demand and how RKG takes each of them into account for our housing projections. So the first piece is accounting for the number of existing owner and renter households that move in a given year. A percentage of those who move end up staying in Danbury, so they live in Danbury today and they move to a new unit in Danbury, whether it's a rental unit or an ownership unit. Those households are comprised of those that currently own, but then buy a new house. So they're an owner today and they're an owner in the future and they buy a new house. It's comprised of those that are renting today, but then choose to purchase a home. So they go from a rental unit to an ownership unit in Danbury. There's also comprised of those who are renting today, but then in the future rent another unit in Danbury. And also comprised of those who currently own a home, but in the future then choose to rent. So all four of those demand factors are kind of bucketed under those existing owners and renters that move each year, but choose to stay in Danbury. You click once, thanks. But then there's also households that are brand new to Danbury. They don't live in the city today, but sometime in the next 10 years, they move to the city. And that is comprised of folks who move to the city and they purchase a home, and folks who move to the city and choose to rent. Next. So when we combine those categories, we end up with existing owners and renters that move and stay within Danbury, and then new households that move to Danbury from elsewhere. Next. So not all of those households will move into a brand new unit that was constructed. Only some percentage will choose or have the means to move into a new housing unit or demand a new unit. So RKG applies a percentage to the total number of those who are moving, which is based on a historical figure from the census PUMS data of those that actually choose new housing. Next. And then that gives us the total demand for new housing units over that 10-year period, which, as I mentioned, about 470 ownership units and about 2,150 rental units. Next, so breaking down future demand by household size, if we assume that household sizes and the percentages of household sizes will remain the same as they are today, we project future demand about 57% of new households will be 1- and 2-person households, and mostly on the younger and older end of the spectrum, as we discussed earlier. But we really can't forget that there's a fairly large percentage, about 25%, that could come from 4+ person households, in line with the changes that we've seen over the last 10 years with that growth in 5+ person households. And the last slide just looks quickly at future households by income level. Again, if we assume very similar income splits to what we have in the city today, about half of new households would have incomes at or below 80% of AMI. For renter households, that figure would jump to 66%, given the lower incomes that we see in Danbury across our renter household spectrum. And that wraps up the data portion.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. And before we move on to asking you questions, it'd probably be appropriate time to stop and see if you have any questions for Eric or myself on all the numbers that he just reviewed.
Can I just interject one second? I'll get the PowerPoint from Francisco and I'll send it around
Yeah,
so we can all
thanks,
have
Sharon.
a chance to digest everything. Great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Hi, could I just get one thing clarified? When Eric mentioned the medium household rent, I think the figure was 1466, including utilities. Am I correct on that? He didn't mention what it would be without utilities.
Yeah, I could, it was Paul, I could get that for you. I could.
Yeah, I don't really need that number, but I mean, just, off the top of my head, let's say utilities are $50, or probably more than that, but say they were, that would mean the rent was actually $50 below that. So say 1415 or something in that vicinity. The question actually is, does that mean that the mean rent in Danbury is at or below the actual numerical number for what the affordable rent should be under the 10 or 15% rule that the state is proposing? That's my question. Is our mean rent in Danbury at or below what it would be if everything was affordable? I mean, it was, if somebody posted the affordable level is 1451, and that would, the mean rent without utilities would be 1415, which would mean that the mean rent is below the threshold for affordable housing. That's all the question is. That's what I was looking for clarification on.
Yeah, if that is the affordable rent that you mentioned, Paul, then yeah, it would be really close. Okay,
And then the other just observation is that at 785, if 30% of the renters in Danbury need an apartment for $775, this particular affordable plan under the state would not be anywhere. It would almost be twice that number. And I don't understand how a private developer, say $300 a square foot, could build an apartment where even the cost of money would be covered by the rent. I think the cost of money for a 700 square foot apartment at $300 a square foot would be approximately $1,250 a month. Just the money alone to cover that would be 50% or 40% higher than the rent. I don't see how we could even begin to accommodate that 785 figure in this town. I just don't see how that could happen. Anyway, those are just two observations I have. Thank you.
Yeah, much of that development that would support households probably at or below 50% of AMI would definitely need a pretty heavily subsidized capital stack. I'm not sure. I don't think the market's going to produce those units on their own, at least not
exactly. I don't think so. Thank you.
Yep.
Right. Any other questions or comments about some of the numbers you saw?
Yes, I'd like to ask a couple questions. One would be, did you consider the possibility of SROs in studios in any of your analysis, especially for the one person or two person units? You had mentioned, I wasn't quite clear as to what you were considering the unit as. The bottom line would be a 1 bedroom, but it was ever taken into consideration that there are SROs as well as studios that we have in the community.
Robert, in terms of which data points, sorry.
Well, any of them. I don't know if you took into consideration, we were discussing the numbers of units and how they were affordable. That we do have access to studios which come in less money than a 1 bedroom apartment, but nothing was mentioned along the presentation as to relating to something an SRO or a studio.
I thought there were studios / 1 bedrooms on one of those data points.
Well, there's a difference in pricing between a studio and a 1 bedroom. I don't know if they clarified that. And if you want to get to that $700-800 mark, yes, you can do that if you're looking at studios.
I see what you mean. Yeah. We did report on the going rents over the change in rents of units that were actively rented over the last 5 years. And that chart, we did compare studios, 1s, 2s, 3s, I think 4+ bedrooms. But on the affordable housing side, I don't think we had data on studios or SROs. I'll have to look back on that.
which would be important. And the other thing I'd like to mention is that when you mentioned that the larger need for the bigger apartments is in downtown, which means it's 5 people or over, that means that they need a 4-bedroom. And I don't know the availability of 4-bedroom units that are downtown. And maybe that's a problem, that we have an overcrowding issue going on and too many people in a smaller apartment, if that's the case. They could be corrected, but from what you're telling me, and the graph that you showed me says that the larger families are downtown in the inner core, and there's not a lot of 4-bedroom units downtown. So how are they living?
I'm not like, hopefully this didn't come off this way. I apologize if it did, but I didn't want to suggest that the larger households are specifically concentrated in downtown. The downtown seemed to us to have an overlap of the current deed restricted affordable housing units tended to be concentrated down there. Lower income households, our most diverse populations, as well as our renter populations tended to be in there. I didn't specifically look at how household size breaks out by census tracts across the city, but that's probably something that we should look at to see where household sizes are the largest across the city.
One of your graphs depicted that there were many of the bigger families, units downtown. I just want to know how we're facilitating that, and I think that might be an issue that needs to be explored.
Okay, great, thank you.
Anyone else? Any questions or comments?
Specifically on the data, do you mean, Francisco?
Yeah, on the presentation, anything at all that didn't make sense to you, or really rang true for that matter. And realizing there are a lot of numbers there, and as Sharon mentioned, you'll get a chance to review. We'll send out a PDF of the presentation. You can look at it in more detail. You can follow up with any questions that you might have. But anything that surprised you, or didn't seem consistent with your experience?
Yes, can I say?
Yep,
Oh, go ahead, Sharon. Sharon, go ahead.
The only quick thing I wanted to say was, remember that there's some breakdown on census tracts, and we only have X 4 or 5 big census tracts. So there's areas within the tracts that are different than you'll know, because we're here and we live it. But sometimes the data is on the tract level, or the mapping looks like a tract level. So in our head, you're looking, you're seeing a mapping. You're not seeing like the rental units over on the west side, and that development over there. It's just a matter of how it's been presented. So it's a tract level. I just want to remind you that. Go ahead, Ted. Sorry.
Oh, no problem. Thank you. Yeah, I have a ton of stuff here, but I'm not going to tie everybody up here today with that, because I really want to see this. There's a lot to unpack here, and I want to go over it when I get a copy of this here. And there's awful lot of stuff to go over. One thing I don't understand, which is not any of your numbers, I guess it's just 830G as it is I don't understand how a unit, if you have a unit that's selling that has a value of $250,000, let's just call it a small 2-bedroom condo that has a 40-year deed restriction on it, and you have another unit right down the road that's selling for $250,000, 2-bedroom unit, very similar, that it does not have a deed restriction on it. That number of 250 may fall under the umbrella of affordable, but it only gets calculated because you have one that's deed restricted and one that's not. Right. Further, what is the goal we're trying to achieve? Is the real purpose here to get someone to get into a rental at an affordable number, or let's call it a purchase price at an affordable number? So somebody buys something with a 40-year deed restriction, and the person right down the road that has the same exact unit, that person down the road is going to be able to rise with home values over the years, and then put some money in their pocket to buy up. That other person is going to stay stagnant for 6 or 7 or 8 years until they move. They're going to sell that unit with the deed restriction remaining without any profit in their pocket. They're stuck in the same problem that they have right now. They don't have no money for a down payment because they've been deed restricted. So what is it that we're trying to do here?
I'll jump in quickly just on the ownership side. In a lot of the models that I've seen around the country, although there is a deed restriction on the purchase price, there's usually measures within the deed restriction that allow for price appreciation. And at the point of sale, the owner is allowed to, I think they do cap the amount of the amount of profit that they can make off the sale. But they are allowed to recapture some of that price appreciation at the point of sale. And then I think when the next buyer, if the deed restriction is still active, the next buyer then buys it at a slightly higher price point than what the previous owner bought it at. So I do believe there are mechanisms within certain forms of ownership housing where I'll call it the first owner does have the ability to capture some of the price appreciation. Because Ted, you're absolutely right. If you were stuck at 250 for 40 years or 30 years and everything around you's gone up by $150,000 for some reason, that would be unfortunate if you weren't able to capture that increment. Because as we know, one of the greatest ways to build wealth in the U.S. is to have that homeownership opportunity and take advantage of that price appreciation and continue to play the market over time. And then, that asset at some point could be something that's left to a family member or to someone else, with the passing of the owner, and whether they choose to live there or they choose to sell it, that's just generational wealth accumulation over time. So your point is well taken.
Yeah, no, it'd be terrific if somebody got into a 2-bedroom apartment and then they were able to, or a 2-bedroom condo, and then they were able to buy a 3-bedroom raised ranch 6 years from now, and then maybe a 4-bedroom colonial afterwards, freeing up those other 2 products that they got out of for someone else. But I think as creative as the 830G was at the time, we're now in 2021 having to really think about how we can figure this thing out, because any developer that finds a piece of land to put apartments on it, it's just market driven. And you can't ask any developer anywhere to say, these are going to come in at a lower price out of the kindness of their heart when there's a bunch of people in line wanting to pay market rates. I think the only way that this works is with some type of creativity on subsidization or subsidies. I don't even know what else. I mean, I went and bought a sheet of plywood to build some shelves last week at Home Depot. Mm-hmm. That was $13. 6 months ago, I paid $58 for that sheet of plywood. There's a whole bunch of sheets of plywood that go in apartments and houses. Mm-hmm. So really, this is a rough time to be meeting on how to build affordable units. So, I love the CHFA programs, CHFA, FHA programs, things like that. Those are tremendous help to people from the down payment standpoint, the interest rate standpoint. And further, we're looking at 30-year fixed rate mortgages in the market right now that are 2 3/8, 2 5/8. It doesn't go any lower than that. Anyway, sorry.
No, it's great. Thank you, Ted. You bring up some really important issues surrounding affordable housing. And in some ways, there are limitations, even, and there are some downsides even for buyers. Their ability to build equity is limited, and that's ostensibly offset by a lower cost of entry, and that maybe they wouldn't have been able to afford to buy to begin with. And these are all important issues. They're relevant to our discussion here this evening. They're relevant to the plan, and this is our opportunity. Really to craft a plan that's going to best suit the needs of Danbury and its residents, while of course meeting the state's mandate. But if there's some tool like deed restriction that you feel is not the strongest tool in the toolbox, then what are the other options for Danbury?
I think Christy has a question.
I have a
comment.
Christy,
yep,
go
and
ahead.
then Bob. Let's go Christy, then Bob Taberson.
Yeah.
I was just hoping for a little, and this is all, first of all, your data is fantastic and it looks just like the data that we've all been looking at. So really appreciate you distilling that for us for Danbury. But I'm wondering I think we have 15 minutes left. I'm just wondering what you need from us tonight if there's a specific question that you need us to answer, or if this, forgive me if you went into this, or if we're just looking for sort of general thoughts.
Yeah, I'd like to remind everyone, we're going to meet 4 more times, and there's still a lot of work ahead of us, and we will have an opportunity to really get into the details of the specific types of housing that you think Danbury should have, where it should be built, what sort of incentives the city could or should put in place. So we'll have an opportunity to get down to that level of detail with respect to recommendations. From you as a committee, we need some guidance. Eric and I can pull all the numbers and put the plan together, but ultimately we need that higher level guidance from you as to what's an appropriate strategy and what are appropriate solutions for Danbury. So I do have 4 questions up on the screen, just to start us out. And yeah, go ahead, Bob, go ahead.
Okay, well, the thing is, maybe what I'm thinking of is connected to what you have for your first discussion. I was wondering where all the Section 8 programs fit in with what you're talking about. And also like senior housing with the government aid programs, were any of these things, were these could included in some of your data there, or are they being separated? Because I see the biggest problems being so much connected to income. And that really, when you're talking about all the major improvements and seem to be incomes over $100,000 and all, when you look at the other way, it's sort of been downhill. So it's just wondering, to me, are we figuring in anything like increasing the Section 8 programs or increasing senior housing? I know there's supposedly lists of people waiting, and I don't know how this all fits in with what we're talking about. I think what was focused on here was of building new affordable housing or finding rentals and all. But I think without taking the component of Section 8 and stuff like that, increasing the amounts, you're not going to hit the lower ends of income.
Well, to answer your question, Bob, I think it's a very good question. Section 8 housing, it's directly relevant to what we're talking about here. It's qualified affordable housing with Section 8 vouchers. It's something the city has a little less control over than, it's federal money that's being funneled through the state. With respect to senior housing, if it's government assisted senior housing, then that contributes to the count as well. And those numbers tend to be far more stable over time. And all of it contributes to your affordable housing inventory. So I think the questions are there opportunities to increase the volume of senior housing that you have? And what are some of the vulnerabilities of the city to fluctuations in the number of Section 8 vouchers that are applied in Danbury? And those are things we need to look at.
All right, yeah, we do look at it in the future. Okay, because there's going to be a number of meetings.
Yeah, and let me just, if I can just respond real quick, because there are a couple of things in the chat box. So, Ari, so that's Paul Rotello. He's a member of the city council here in Danbury and involved in, obviously, in the housing rental properties. And Christy, I don't have anybody participating necessarily. She said, will there be any renters and low-income residents participating on this committee? I mean, Jen's here from the HACD. I'd be happy to get some names of people, that you could give me that, but we had intended to do some outreach to try to get some input from residents. But at this point, this was kind of the group we had pulled together, but we're more than happy to, we can talk offline about anybody that you think might be, help us in this endeavor. Because we want this to be a plan that's supported by the community and not just put together by a bunch of people sitting around or a meeting on it. So it's really important, the community input for whatever strategies that we come up with.
Happy to help you
And
do
so-
that. Sorry, I put it in the chat just to you. I didn't mean to. It
Oh,
wasn't.
sorry. That's okay. No problem. But no, but it's a good, fair question because we went roundabout so everybody knows like who should, be on the committee and understanding that we were going to do this outreach and whether or not it's a survey, but just, from Kara and myself, our perspective in our departments, we can reach out to the populations here, but we felt the good connection would be like, having Jen on the committee through the Housing Authority as well.
Okay. Eric and I have about 10 minutes left before we have to jump into another meeting. So looking at the questions that we have in front of you, does anyone want to chime in on the specific populations that you feel that probably are most in need of affordable housing in Danbury? Obviously low-income populations, but maybe there's special groups, whether it's seniors or young families, immigrant families. Areas of the city that might be most appropriate for new housing development, affordable housing, and preferred development type. And then finally, how proactive do you feel the city should be in expanding affordable housing? And the city does have a role. I mean, the market has to meet the city, but it has a role in various zoning incentives and other things it could do to encourage, incentivize affordable housing. So I'll turn it over to you folks for the last 10 minutes.
Well, Francisco, Paul Rotello here. On the last one, how proactive should the city be in expanding affordable housing supply? I think from my point of view, the committee should determine whether it wants to satisfy the state's definition of affordable housing, which we already have, but I mean, we want to continue to maintain that, maintain our good graces with the state of Connecticut, or do we, I don't happen to consider, and I think this has been borne out, that those numbers are particularly affordable. If our mean rents are already below that level and people are struggling at the numbers that the slides indicate, we have a long way to go, or the state has a long way to go, or the HUD does, in defining what affordable housing is in Fairfield County. But we can do that. And that one of the issues that keeps people like me up at night and our phone ringing on weekends is any sort of disturbance to a neighborhood, people who are existing homeowners or renters. If we do something that, in their view, jeopardize their status, it causes anything from an anxiety attack to a panic attack. One thing that not being at that 10% level puts us in jeopardy of is losing influence over our own zoning laws. So keeping it at 10% or above obviates that particular issue. But again, it doesn't, as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't really address what affordability means in Danbury, what it has to mean in Danbury. And I think this commission needs to maintain that level of 10% or above, but I think we need to go beyond that and actually figure out what affordability is. And I don't think that whatever that, what is it, S30G or something like that, I don't even think that begins to address it. And I think addressing that, somebody mentioned before, I think it was Robert, smaller apartments, for instance, studios. If you take a typical Victorian that's been broken up, a 3-4 Victorian, into 3 apartments, are generally about 1,000 square feet each. But that's all you can do. I mean, in many neighborhoods, 3 families are the most you can get in that zone. But if you broke each one of those up into 2 apartments and allowed landlords to put in 6, pressure on neighborhoods certainly, but it would mean that the price would drop considerably per unit, and that would be one way to address it. But that would require retooling the zoning laws in Danbury. It would have nothing to do with the state. It would be a local decision. And I think, for me anyway, we would probably need to look at that if we actually want people to be able to afford housing in Danbury, and not simply to be able to say to the state, hey, look, we're above the 10% number, which we already are. So that's something that occurs to me. And I think Commissioner Haddad's comments were very provocative, and they lead to a whole bunch of lateral thinking that we don't even have time to approach here, but some of those things need to be considered. Thank you, Francisco. Appreciate it. Appreciate the time.
Thank you.
So we can, I guess, Francisco, you can,
Yep.
we can ask the committee to, think about kind of these
Yeah.
discussion issues for the next time around. And then I just wanted to get through, and I know you guys have to get off to another meeting, but I just wanted to touch base with the committee about kind of the next steps and seeing if this day and time of the month is good for everybody. We'll continue to do, just get some feedback.
Can I just ask one last question before we leave to Francisco? In the thoughts and process, did anyone discuss with you actually what Danbury's decided to be our ceiling as far as the amount of people? Do we want to be a Stanford in the future, or are we going to cap out at 120,000 people? I mean, all this should be part of our analysis.
And Robert, much of that work is being conducted through the Plan of Conservation and Development, which will take that head on. And we are just starting our public outreach component of that. And we have an online survey that was going to be going live in a few weeks. And we're asking questions exactly like that. So I expect that guidance to come directly through the Plan of Conservation and Development. One of the things that we expect to do is that if we have recommendations coming out of the Plan of Conservation and Development that differ from a little bit from the track we're on with the Affordable Housing Plan, because the Affordable Housing Plan is due in June before we'll be complete with the POCD, is that we'll go back and rework as necessary so the two are consistent. But that's a central issue and question to be answered.
And it's a major question because in that consideration, we have to decide, all right, we're going to grow, but are we going to grow to the point now where we're going to have more children, which we can't handle now with the schools? And how are we going to look in the future? So it's great that we have this committee and we should be doing it diligently, but we need to have some guidance as to where we're going and how we're going to get there.
Yep. Yes, thank you. So our next steps, Eric and I, we have some work to do. We'll be putting together an online survey specific to affordable housing issues. And at our next meeting, we'll update you on progress with respect to that. We'll get further into the analysis and doing our homework and come back to you with some more material and discussion for our next meeting. With respect to the meeting schedule, we do want to identify a regular meeting schedule. And, basically what day and time of week work best for you? Is it Mondays? Mondays are a little tricky for me because I have a monthly meeting at 5:30 that I'm going into in like 2 minutes. Is there anything we want to try to pin down right now? Mondays, if we met at 3:30, maybe that would give me a little more flexibility, or is it Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday?
3:30 is fine with me.
Yeah, 3 is good. 3:30 is good.
Yeah, 3 is good.
Yeah, I'm retired. I'll find
3
the time.
o'clock. Okay.
Hey, Bob. I know.
Whatever works, I'll go along with it.
Okay, why don't we try to
Mondays.
3 on
pitch it?
Mondays works for me.
Okay,
3
let's try
o'clock.
to move it up, Francisco, to give you some breathing room. So we'll set the next one for October. Is that the 18th? Yeah, but either 3 or 3:30. And if you can't make 3, you can come in when you can. Again, we're going to post the meeting so you can watch it again at Granicus through the city's website. And I'll send you guys the PowerPoint. But let's plan on, I guess, where are we at? Are we on the 13th? So you wanted, I'm sorry. You want to do the 11th or the 18th? Works for everybody. Third Monday or second Monday?
Which one's Columbus Day? Is Columbus Day on the 11th?
Oh, yeah, that's the 11th. Yeah, that's not good.
It is the 11th.
Let's try for the 18th.
The 18th.
And I'm more than happy to celebrate my 35th anniversary with you guys.
Oh, well, good thing
So
we're
good, we'll be done
early.
so I can go out for dinner or
Good
something.
thing we're starting early.
Okay, I'll send a reminder out with the PowerPoint so that we just all can mark our calendars. And if we need to change it a little along the way, that's good too. And if you have any questions, shoot me an email. I'll, on a regular basis, talk to Francisco, obviously, and, or any thoughts or comments once you've looked at everything. Because there's a lot to digest, but great input and great comments. I really appreciate it. Anybody? I think
Yes.
Francisco's got to run. Eric's
Yeah.
got to run. So I'll let them go. If you guys want to continue to chat, that's fine. They can watch the end of it.
Thank you, everyone. We'll get
Thank you,
PDF.
Francisco.
We'll get
Thank
the
you,
PDF out to
Sharon.
you shortly.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye. Okay. I guess we'll stop
Sayonara.
there. Yes. Till next month. Again, if you have any questions or information, Christy, you have anybody's names, please. We'd love to hear from you. Paul, you know where to get me. Bob, you know where to get me.
Yeah.
Ari, nice to meet you.
A lot of
Ted, I got to
material.
talk to you tomorrow.
All
I
right,
got
so
to
A lot
talk
of
to you tomorrow.
material. Be good to be able to look.
Okay,
through.
Sharon.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone.
See you Wednesday, John.
5:28, we're going to adjourn.